A bishop is buried, but his final confession was never heard, until now. Welcome to Sherlock Mystery. I am your host, Thornby. Where are you unraveling this mystery from? Let me know in the comments. Reading your thoughts is my favorite part of this journey. Let's begin. It was a grey October morning, the kind when the fog hangs over London like a shroud, wrapping rooftops and chimneys in a ghostly veil. I had just returned to Baker Street with a parcel of smoked haddock and was setting it on the breakfast table when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, shuffled in with a sealed envelope on a silver tray. "For Mr. Holmes," she said. "It came by special courier." Quite insistent he was. Holmes, half draped in his dressing gown and deeply absorbed in a monograph he was composing on the migratory patterns of urban ravens, took the letter without so much as a glance. Only after Mrs. Hudson had shut the door behind her did he break the seal and scan its contents. His brows lifted the barest inch. "Watson," he said, rising, "have you ever had occasion to visit Ely?" "Ely? I can't say I have. A cathedral town, isn't it? Cambridgeshire." "Indeed, a medieval gem in a rather quiet setting. It would seem that murder has finally remembered it exists." I set aside my fork. "Murder?" Holmes handed me the letter. It was on thick vellum paper bearing a purple wax seal impressed with a bishop's ring. The penmanship was elegant, though a little shaky, and the signature at the bottom read, "Reverend Jonathan Ellsworth, Dean of Ely Cathedral. My dear Mr. Holmes, a most disturbing event has taken place within the sacred bounds of our cathedral. Bishop Ambrose Trevelyan, retired but deeply beloved, was found dead yesterday morning beneath the stone steps of the crypt. A fall, we were told. And yet, something is not right. The cathedral physician is uneasy. The sexton swears the bishop was never near the lower levels the night before. And most curious of all, in the bishop's hand was clutched a torn scrap of parchment, the corner of what appears to have once been a confession. I pray you find time to travel to Ely at once. I have sealed off the crypt. Scotland Yard has not yet been involved at the bishop's nephew's request. Yours in urgency and faith, Jonathan Ellsworth." Dean, I looked up. A bishop found dead with a confession in hand? How can Scotland Yard not be involved? "Because," Holmes said, "when the church handles its own dead, it prefers to keep its ghosts out of the papers. That makes it all the more curious they would send for me." He turned to the hearth, where his pipe lay nestled in the folds of yesterday's Times. "I believe a train leaves King's Cross at noon. Pack your warmest coat, Watson. The cathedral close will not offer us tea and civility, but something much colder, secrets buried under stone." And thus it was, by 2 that afternoon, we found ourselves rocking gently northward, through the fens of Cambridgeshire, the fields sodden and silver with mist. Holmes sat motionless for much of the journey, tapping a finger lightly against his chin. I knew the rhythm well. Not idle thought, but deduction forming in layers, like frost across a window. "I'm troubled," he said at last, "by the note. Specifically, by what it does not say." "You mean the cause of death?" "No, Watson. I mean the confession. A bishop dies clutching a fragment of one, and yet the dean never tells us what it said." I frowned. Perhaps he thought it irrelevant. Holmes gave a slight shake of the head. "Then he is either a fool or has something to hide. We must assume from the moment we step off the train that someone in Ely does not wish the truth to be known." We arrived at dusk. Ely Cathedral loomed above the town, like a ship carved in stone, its Norman towers and Gothic lanterns swaddled in shadow. The close was quiet, unnervingly so. A single figure waited for us at the gate, tall, thin, wrapped in a long black coat, and wearing a clerical collar that gleamed dully in the gaslight. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Dean Ellsworth, I'm grateful for your swift arrival. You must be tired." Holmes inclined his head. "Explanations first, Dean. We can rest when the bishop does." The Dean's expression grew grave. Very well. The body is in the vestry chapel awaiting a private autopsy. I've arranged for you to be present, but the crypt is sealed, and I'm afraid the bishop's nephew, Mr. Lionel Trevelyan, is resistant to outside inquiry. Then we shall speak to him first, Holmes said, and then we shall go below. Darkness suits confessions, even torn ones. The Dean led us across the flagstones of the cloister, the sound of our footsteps muffled by ancient silence. Somewhere in the far nave, a single candle flickered. As we entered the vestry, I caught sight of the bishop's body lying beneath a heavy cloth. On the table beside it, under a glass dome, lay a crumpled scrap of parchment. Holmes bent close. One word was visible in a spidery hand. Forgive. Holmes turned to me, his eyes bright and cold. Tell me, Watson, who does the bishop need forgiving, and who silenced his last words? To be continued. Holmes remained crouched beside the table for some time, studying the torn parchment beneath the glass dome. The light from the vestry window, weak though it was in the cathedral gloom, picked out the raised texture of old ink and faint creases in the paper. His gaze was fixed, but not on the visible word alone. Rather on something deeper, less obvious. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small magnifying lens, holding it to his eye and leaning closer still. Interesting, he murmured. I came to stand behind him. What do you see? The parchment is not from a confession book, Watson. Look at the grain. It's handmade, likely French. Not something a bishop would have kept for official records. Then it wasn't a formal confession? Holmes straightened. Not in the ecclesiastical sense, no. More likely a personal one. Which raises the question, why was the bishop carrying it into the crypt in the dead of night? Dean Ellsworth, who had hovered respectfully near the door, now spoke. That is precisely what unsettles me. Bishop Trevelyan was retired from office these past 6 years. He had no duties involving the crypt. No reason to be there. Unless, Holmes said, he was summoned there. Summoned? I asked. Holmes turned to the Dean. Has anyone among the cathedral staff recently left without notice or fallen ill in suspicious circumstances? The Dean hesitated. No, though the verger, Mr. Phelps, has taken to drink of late, and our assistant organist vanished for several days last month before returning with a tale about his brother's wedding in Edinburgh, which no one could verify. You believe one of them may have lured the bishop to the crypt? I believe, Holmes replied, that whoever orchestrated this encounter expected the bishop to bring something with him, or leave something behind. He stepped away from the table, retrieving his gloves from his coat. I should like to examine the crypt, now if possible. The Dean looked troubled. It has been sealed, Mr. Holmes. Holmes gave a tight smile. Then I recommend we unseal it. The vestry doors opened at Holmes' request, and a grey-robed sexton appeared, bearing a lantern and a heavy iron ring of keys. He said nothing as we followed him through a winding passage, down 2 sets of steps, and into the chill silence of the lower cathedral. The crypt was a narrow chamber of stone and shadow. Arched alcoves lined the walls, most filled with ancient sarcophagi and crumbling effigies. The scent was thick, dust, decay, and the faintest tinge of old incense. Holmes motioned for the lantern. The sexton handed it over wordlessly. Holmes crouched once more, inspecting the area where the bishop had fallen. A spray of dark residue stained the flagstones. Blood, long dried. Observe, he said quietly. The direction of the blood spatter. The bishop fell forward. Yet look, the impact point is too far from the stairwell. I squinted at the stain. He was struck, then moved. Precisely. His head injury is consistent with a blunt force strike, not a fall. And more curious still, Holmes angled the lantern. There are faint drag marks along the stone. The body was repositioned after death. Dean Ellsworth looked pale. You're certain? as certain as the laws of geometry, the angle of the wound, the location of the stain. It all suggests he was killed here, but not by accident. Someone wished it to appear so. He rose, sweeping the light across the floor. Now here, this is more telling. He pointed to a small patch of disturbed dust beneath one of the alcoves. Lying there was a broken piece of wax. Holmes knelt again, plucking it up with tweezers. The wax was deep purple and bore the impression of a signet ring. The exact match, I realized, to the seal on the bishop's letter. "A second letter?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Or a will. Or perhaps the rest of that confession. Whatever it was, it is no longer here, which means—" A voice called from the stairwell. "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson!" We turned to see a young man descending, tall, well-groomed, dressed in a black coat with a silk scarf. His manner was formal but strained. "I am Lionel Trevelyan. I understand you've been given leave to examine my uncle's body." "I must protest." Holmes met him mid-aisle. "You must do no such thing. If you wish to see justice done, Mr. Trevelyan, you'll assist me rather than hinder. Your uncle was murdered." The young man recoiled. "That's outrageous. Then help me disprove it." Trevelyan stood rigid. "You speak of murder in sacred ground, Mr. Holmes. That is not an accusation one throws about lightly." "I do nothing lightly," Holmes replied. "What was your relationship with the bishop?" "I visited often. He was a man of great conviction and loneliness. Since retirement, he kept to himself, read a great deal, corresponded widely." "Corresponded?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Would his letters have been preserved?" Trevelyan hesitated. "Some. His study is as he left it. I have not had the strength to go through his things." "Then you must allow me to do so. Where is this study?" "In the bishop's residence. St. Ulrich's house by the southern cloister." Holmes nodded. "Dr. Watson and I will join you there shortly. Before that, one more matter." He returned to the disturbed alcove and knelt once again. With a gloved hand, he brushed away the dust more thoroughly. I leaned in beside him and saw a small rectangle of discoloration upon the floor. "Something rested here," he said. "For some time. See how the dust has settled around it. A box, perhaps. A casket." He stood, expression tight with focus. "Someone took whatever was left behind after moving the bishop's body, which means they returned to the scene after the supposed accident, possibly during the night." Trevelyan shifted uncomfortably. "Are you suggesting one of the clergy?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I suggest nothing. I observe. But someone in this cathedral is hiding a truth the bishop tried to confess. And as you said, Mr. Trevelyan, such accusations are not made lightly." He turned on his heel, lantern swinging. "To the bishop's study, Watson. Let us see what a man of God feared enough to bring into the tomb." As we emerged once more into the misty close, I glanced back at the towering cathedral. A place meant for sanctity and silence, now cloaked in suspicion. The bishop had died clutching a confession, but whose sins was he prepared to reveal? And who ensured he never could? Holmes said nothing as we walked, but I saw in his stride the certainty of a man who had already glimpsed the path ahead. There were shadows in Ely, and not all of them were cast by stone. The study at St. Ulrich's house bore the hushed, preserved air of a chamber frozen in contemplation. A tall, arched window admitted the last silver blush of daylight, though the interior remained cloaked in gloom. Heavy drapes, dark oak bookshelves, and a broad writing desk draped with neatly ordered documents gave the room a monastic solemnity befitting its late occupant. A brass crucifix hung beside a shelf of leather-bound theological tomes, and beneath it stood a locked cabinet. Holmes moved through the room with his usual economy, hands clasped behind his back, eyes roving from corner to corner like a hawk assessing terrain. I remained near the door as Lionel Trevelyan lit a lamp and gestured toward the desk. "His papers are there. I haven't touched them." Holmes gave a nod. but did not yet approach. Instead, he studied the floorboards, the dust patterns on the cabinet's top, the subtle indentation in the carpet where a chair had stood, now absent. "Did the bishop receive visitors often?" he asked. "Rarely. A few scholars, an old friend from Canterbury now and then. Most correspondence was conducted by post." Holmes's gaze paused at a small pile of unopened letters tied with a black ribbon. He untied it carefully, examining the envelopes. All were addressed to Bishop Trevelyan, but one bore no return address. The seal was broken, once opened, but evidently never answered. Holmes extracted the letter and unfolded it. The parchment was thinner than the fragment found in the crypt, but the handwriting was unmistakably the same. That same wavering, precise script. Holmes read silently, then handed it to me. "To the Right Reverend Ambrose Trevelyan. You know what we both saw and what was buried with the past. I can no longer remain silent, not while I still breathe. The burden must be shared. Come to the crypt, midnight. I will bring the box. You bring your courage. You know the place. The shadows remember." The letter was unsigned. "A summons," I said. This was no accident then. The bishop was called to a meeting he did not survive. Holmes nodded. "And the author speaks of what was buried. There was once something else interred here, some truth or evidence hidden from the world." He now turned to the locked cabinet and knelt before it. From his coat, he produced a delicate set of tools, a rolled case of picks and thin files that gleamed faintly in the lamplight. With deft precision, he set to work. Within moments, the lock yielded with a quiet click. Inside, a narrow wooden box rested atop a stack of files. Holmes lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged and labeled in the bishop's hand, were dozens of letters bundled with twine, all marked penitential correspondence. He selected a few at random, scanning them rapidly. "Confessions," he murmured. "Private letters from clergy and laity alike, all written in confidence to the bishop, a dangerous archive if improperly kept." Trevelyan stepped forward. "He never destroyed them?" "Apparently not," Holmes replied. "He preserved them, possibly to shield someone, or to use if need arose. Use them? For what purpose? Protection, leverage, or atonement?" Holmes closed the box and replaced it in the cabinet. "Tell me, Mr. Trevelyan, did your uncle speak often of his past?" "Rarely. He was private by nature. There was some old controversy during his days at seminary, but it was never discussed. He took his vows seriously. Too seriously, perhaps." "Did he ever mention a man named—" Holmes paused, tapping the letter from the crypt. "Jonathan Payne?" Trevelyan's face registered no recognition. "Number should he have?" "That remains to be seen." Holmes moved back to the desk and swept his eyes across its surface. A blotter, an inkwell, a pocket Bible. Beneath the Bible, he found a smaller key which he pocketed without a word. Then, pulling open the drawer, he withdrew a bundle of old church programs, ordination notices, eulogies, and among them a pamphlet with a faded photograph. He turned it to face us. The image showed a much younger Bishop Trevelyan beside three other men, one of whom was labelled in a scrawled note, "Jonathan Payne, Assistant Curate, 1869. Holmes's eyes narrowed. So he did exist. A man the bishop knew well. This photograph is over 30 years old. What happened between them? The room fell quiet, heavy with unspoken speculations. Holmes stood abruptly. "I must speak to the verger. You said earlier he'd taken to drink." "Yes," Trevelyan confirmed. "Arthur Phelps. He's often found in the chantry after hours. Keeps to the shadows. A grim fellow." Holmes smiled thinly. Grim men are often watchers, and watchers see what others miss. As we crossed back through the cloister, the evening air had turned sharper, the mist thickening into a pale fog that clung to stone like cobwebs. The great bell tower tolled softly overhead, the notes muffled by the night. In the chantry, the smell of wax and damp wool lingered. There, seated in the rear pew and nursing a flask beneath his robes, sat the verger, a hunched figure with a wild, unshaven beard and eyes that flickered as we entered. Holmes approached quietly and sat beside him without introduction. "Arthur Phelps?" The verger grunted. "That depends who's asking." "Sherlock Holmes?" Another grunt. "Figured as much. Thought you'd be taller." Holmes ignored the remark. "Tell me what you saw the night Bishop Trevelyan died." The man hesitated, then took a swig from his flask. "You won't like it." "Truth is rarely polite," Holmes replied. Phelps sighed. "I was sweeping the south aisle just after 11. Heard footsteps near the crypt. Thought it odd. No services, no reason for anyone to be down there. I followed, quiet-like. Saw the bishop with a lantern. He weren't alone." "Who was with him?" Phelps looked away. "Didn't see the face. Hooded. They spoke soft, but it turned ugly. Voices raised, then a blow. The lantern fell. I hid behind the pillar. Heard a scuffle, then silence." "You didn't intervene?" "I'm not a soldier, Mr. Holmes, and I've seen death before." This wasn't the first time the crypt hid a secret. Holmes studied him. "Did you see what they carried?" Phelps nodded slowly. "A box, small, black. The other man took it after the bishop stopped breathing. And he left nothing. Number, but he paused. Dropped something on the steps, I think. I didn't wait to see more. Coward's instincts, perhaps, but I'm still breathing." Holmes stood. "You've done more than most." As we left the chantry, Holmes's stride quickened. "We now know this much. The bishop was summoned by a man from his past, connected to a shared secret. A box changed hands that night. And someone in this cathedral is willing to kill to keep its contents from the light." I looked at him. "You have a theory?" Holmes did not answer at once. His eyes scanned the cathedral spire silhouetted against the fog. "Not a theory, Watson," he said at last. "A shadow. And tomorrow we bring it into the light." The morning broke thin and grey over Ely. Its pale light diffused through the persistent fog. I found Holmes already awake, seated at the small table in our inn's modest sitting room, breakfast untouched, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The newspaper lay open beside him, though I suspected he had not read a word. "You've not slept," I said. "A few hours," he replied absently. "Sufficient. The mind does not require rest so much as silence, and I've had that in abundance." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat opposite him. "You've drawn a conclusion?" He nodded. "A partial one. Enough to prod the next stone loose, but not yet the entire path." Holmes rose and paced to the window, drawing aside the curtain. Outside, the cathedral loomed, its tower dissolving into mist. "There is a pattern, Watson. A decades-old wrong, buried, now unearthed. The question is not what was in the box. That will reveal itself soon enough. But who feared its contents most?" He turned back to me, his expression suddenly sharp. "And why now? Why, after 30 years, did the bishop's sins or secrets resurface in this specific week?" "An anniversary," I offered. "A deathbed threat?" "Or a final reckoning," he said. "A man can carry guilt like a stone around the neck until either death or redemption unburdens him." I suspect the bishop intended the latter. We made our way once again to the cathedral close, this time to seek out Dean Ellsworth. We found him in his office, reading beneath a pool of lamplight. He looked up as we entered and gestured for us to sit. "Have you made progress?" he asked. "We've uncovered a name," Holmes said. "Jonathan Payne, assistant curate in the late 1860s. Does that name ring any bells?" The dean's brow furrowed. "Payne. Yes. I've read the name in the diocesan records. He was ordained here, briefly served under Bishop Trevelyan when the latter was still a canon. Left suddenly. No reason given. There was a quiet scandal, if I recall. Something buried. Exactly, Holmes said. Do you know if Payne is still alive? The Dean opened a drawer and pulled out a battered registry. He turned several pages with careful fingers. Jonathan Payne, born 1841. Suspended from clerical duty in 1870. No record of death. He looked up. He could be alive, but he would be in his 80s. Long enough to carry a grudge, or seek forgiveness, Holmes murmured. He rose and moved to the window. There's another matter I need your assistance with, Dean. I believe the cathedral archives may contain sealed reports, disciplinary records, internal inquiries. I must examine them. The Dean hesitated. That material is not generally available. A man has been murdered, Holmes interrupted, and the killer may be one of your own. I don't request access out of idle curiosity. There was a long pause. Finally, the Dean nodded. Very well, I'll arrange it. The archives are kept below the chapter house. An hour later, we stood amid the dust and silence of the archives. Wooden drawers lined the walls, labeled by year and diocese. A clerk brought us a narrow box marked Ecclesiastical Proceedings, 1869 to 1871. Holmes set to work quickly, scanning each page with methodical precision. Near the bottom of the stack he paused. His hand hovered over a file stamped "Private, not for public record." He opened it. The document was brief, just 3 pages, handwritten in ink that had faded to a rusted brown. It was a report, signed by a then-young Ambrose Trevelyan, detailing a disciplinary investigation into Jonathan Payne. Payne had been accused of inappropriate conduct with a young parishioner, not criminal by law, but morally damning. The girl had vanished soon after, sent to a relative's home in Dorset. Payne had resigned his post within the month. No charges were brought, but the record was sealed. Holmes read in silence, then passed it to me. This is the fulcrum, he said. A buried shame, known to the bishop, perhaps witnessed. Something that Payne wished to expose before death, and which Trevelyan feared would bring ruin to his name and the church. I looked up from the page. You think the bishop was being blackmailed? No, Holmes said. I think he was ready to confess. But someone else wasn't. He returned the file to the box and closed the lid with a deliberate motion. Now we must find Jonathan Payne, alive or in memory. Someone here knows where he went, or what became of him. We returned to the cloister, where Holmes asked to speak again with the sexton, Arthur Phelps. After some delay, he emerged from a side chapel, blinking at the daylight. I've already told you what I saw, he said warily. You have, Holmes said. But I believe there's something more. You knew Payne, didn't you? The man flinched. Holmes stepped closer. You recognized him that night in the crypt. Not just a shadow, a man from your past. Phelps' shoulders sagged. Aye, he muttered. I knew him. Was a lad when he served here. Remembered the voice. Never forgot it. You said he carried a box. Phelps nodded. Black with silver clasp. Held it like it was fragile. Did he say anything else? Phelps swallowed. Only this. We can't leave it hidden forever. Then the bishop said something I didn't hear and, well, you know the rest. Holmes fell silent. I could see the connections knitting together behind his eyes. He turned suddenly. Where was Payne staying? Phelps hesitated. There's an old cottage east of the Abbey Gardens. Belonged to the caretaker once. Abandoned, but some say they've seen lights there, off and on. We made for it at once. The garden paths were slick with dew, the hedges overgrown. The cottage stood behind a crumbling wall, ivy choking its windows. The door creaked open under Holmes's hand. Inside was the unmistakable smell of sickness. Dust, must, and the bitter tang of old medicine. A single cot lay in the corner, its sheets tangled and cold. A kettle rested on the hearth, long cooled. But on the table, beneath a cracked oil lamp, lay a letter. Holmes picked it up. The address was written in the same tremulous hand. To whom it may concern, I am Jonathan Payne. This is my final testimony. Within the enclosed box lies a truth long concealed. The bishop swore never to speak of it, and for that I forgave him. But silence does not erase the wound. What was buried beneath the chapel in 1870 must be known. If I am gone, let justice speak where the church would not. The letter ended there. There was no signature, but the message was clear. Beside the letter was a small key. Holmes held it up, then turned to me. It's time we return to the crypt. But what are we looking for? Holmes's eyes gleamed with conviction. A grave, he said. One that was never marked, and a truth left buried with it. The key Payne had left behind was old, brass, worn smooth by years of handling, and engraved with a single numeral, 7. Holmes examined it in silence as we stepped out into the soft grey hush of the cloister. The cathedral loomed ahead, massive and solemn, its stones dark with moisture. Fog drifted low across. The grass and the bell above us struck the hour in deep, mournful tones. Vault 7, Holmes said at last, tucking the key into his coat. Buried in the crypt, not metaphorically, Watson, but quite literally. Payne intended to exhume the truth. And the bishop meant to stop him? Not necessarily, Holmes replied. I believe the bishop had made peace with what must come. His presence in the crypt was not confrontational. It was confessional. But someone else was not prepared to let that secret surface. He quickened his pace, and I followed. We passed once again through the nave, the great arches yawning above us like the ribs of some petrified beast. The flickering glow of votive candles illuminated small shrines along the side aisles. The only other figure present was a nun, silent in her prayers beneath a stained glass window, unmoving as a statue. We descended into the crypt in silence, lantern in hand. The damp stone corridor opened before us like a passage into the earth. Vaults lined each side, small chambers sealed by carved wooden doors, each marked with a Roman numeral. Holmes moved with purpose, counting softly under his breath. 4, 5, 6. Here. He stopped before a narrow door, darkened with age. Above it, carved directly into the arch, was the numeral 7. Holmes inserted the key. It turned with a reluctant groan. The door swung open, releasing a stale breath of air and a stronger scent of mildew and earth. Inside, the chamber was small, no more than 10 feet across, the walls rough-hewn and unfinished, unlike the other ornate crypt alcoves. There was no sarcophagus, no plaque, no inscription, only the remnants of a stone slab, partially sunken into the floor, its surface cracked. Holmes stepped in, raising the lantern. This vault was never completed, or rather, it was abandoned after its purpose was fulfilled. I hesitated at the threshold. Then what's buried here? Holmes knelt and examined the slab. The stone was moved and reset. Poorly. See here. Fresh chisel marks on the edge, the dust not fully settled. He turned to me. Help me lift it. Together, with some difficulty, we managed to shift the slab aside. The stone grated against the floor, revealing a hollow beneath. Perhaps 4 feet deep, a cavity carved into the earth and lined with bricks. Within it lay a small blackened chest, the kind used for personal effects, now wrapped in mold-darkened cloth. Holmes pulled it free and placed it on the crypt floor. He opened the lid. Inside, carefully packed in layers of oiled paper, were letters, a locket, and, at the bottom, a child's small woolen gown. It was stained, the colors faded, but unmistakable in form. Atop the fabric was a silver ring, its band engraved with 2 initials. A T. I heard Holmes exhale sharply. So, the final piece. He reached for the letters and scanned them swiftly. They were written in a woman's hand. Series of desperate pleas addressed to both Bishop Trevelyan and occasionally to Jonathan Payne. You both knew. You were there when it happened. I begged for protection, and all I received was silence. She was born in shame and buried in secret. You buried her, Ambrose. You gave the order. I felt the cold of the crypt seep into my bones. Dear God, I whispered. They buried a child. Holmes nodded grimly. The daughter of a young parishioner, conceived in violation, born in secrecy, and dead within days. Trevelyan was complicit in her concealment. Perhaps not the crime, but certainly the cover-up. Payne must have carried that guilt ever since. And Trevelyan, Holmes said, chose silence. Until now. This vault was never recorded, never sanctified. It was meant to be forgotten. I crouched beside the box. The locket, does it hold a name? Holmes opened it. Inside was a miniature painting of a girl, young and sad-eyed. No inscription, no date. But someone knew she was here, Holmes said. Someone who feared this evidence would resurface. When Payne returned, the balance shifted, and that fear turned lethal. We replaced the chest and covered the vault once more. As we stepped into the corridor, a sound reached us from above. Hurried footsteps. Then a voice echoed faintly down the stairwell. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. It was the Dean's voice, tight with urgency. We emerged into the nave to find him rushing toward us, face pale. Mr. Trevelyan, he panted. He's gone. His carriage was seen leaving town before dawn. Holmes's jaw tightened. Gone? Convenient. He claimed he was going to Cambridge to settle estate matters. But the housekeeper says he packed in haste, left letters behind. One was addressed to you. We returned to the study at St. Ulrich's house, where the Dean handed Holmes a sealed envelope. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the page. Mr. Holmes, there are truths we carry like anchors, dragging us through life. My uncle was a man of the cloth, yes, but also a man of weakness. He confided in me, years ago, what he had done, or failed to stop. I begged him to reveal it. He would not. And so, when Payne returned, threatening to tear open the tomb, I acted. I did not plan to kill him, only to frighten him, to destroy what he had brought, but fear overtook me. I struck harder than I meant. He fell, and with him, any chance for silence. I am not fleeing justice, Mr. Holmes. I am surrendering to it. By the time you read this, I shall be en route to the magistrate in Norwich. Let them decide what must follow. Let the dead speak. L.T. Holmes set the letter down, his face unreadable. So it was the nephew, I said quietly. Yes, Holmes said. The man with everything to lose. The family name, the bishop's legacy, the social standing. But not, I think, malice. Merely fear. And fear, Watson, is often more dangerous than hatred. The Dean sat down heavily. What shall we do with the vault? Holmes looked at him. You will consecrate it properly. Place a stone, a name if one can be found. The church hid a grave. Now it must raise a monument. We stood once more before the cathedral as the fog began to lift, thin rays of sunlight filtering through the mist. The great bell tolled again, but this time its voice seemed less mournful, more resolute. Holmes lit his pipe, his expression calm. One day, he said, some parishioner will wander past that stone and wonder who lies beneath it, and in that wonder she will be remembered. That, Watson, is justice of a kind. And with that, he turned from Ely Cathedral, his footsteps light, the burden of the case lifted behind him like smoke. We did not leave Ely at once. Though Holmes might have declared the matter closed in spirit, there remained duties of conscience and consequence that tethered us still. Scotland Yard, once apprised of the confession and the attempted flight of Lionel Trevelyan, dispatched an inspector to intercept the carriage en route to Norwich. By Holmes's estimation, the young man had not intended to vanish, but to preempt public scandal by surrendering beyond the diocese's jurisdiction. It was a strategic act cloaked in penitence, not unlike the bishop's final descent into the crypt. While awaiting the inspector's arrival, Holmes and I returned to St. Ulrich's house, where the mood had shifted to quiet reverence. The staff moved softly, whispers replacing routine. Something unspeakable had been named, and its naming cast a different light over every arch, corridor, and carved saint. For the first time, I sensed that the cathedral's grandeur, its choir, its chapels, its resplendent tower, served not only as monument, but also as shield. The truth had hidden behind reverence as effectively as behind stone. Holmes, however, was restless. He stood by the fire with the bishop's correspondence spread across the mantelpiece, sorting letters with surgical precision. From time to time, he examined the seal impressions or traced faded ink with the tip of his finger. It was not idle curiosity that animated him, but a question still unvoiced. "The case is concluded," I ventured. "The motive revealed, the culprit confessed. What remains?" Holmes didn't answer at once. He selected one letter, a modest envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand, and studied it again. Then slowly, he turned. "Watson, you recall the locket found in the vault? The miniature of the girl?" "Of course." There was no name, no inscription, but I believe she had one. I frowned. Payne's letter didn't name her. "Number, but this one does." He passed me the envelope. The script was precise but humble. The return address bore a name unfamiliar to me. Marianne Cooper, Willow Cottage, Bramley Hill. And the postmark dated from 3 years earlier. Inside, the single sheet read, "To Bishop Trevelyan, I do not write to accuse, only to remember. My sister died in pain, and the child with her. You gave your blessing for their quiet rest, and I have never spoken of it to another soul. But I wonder if you recall her name. It was Grace. That is all I ask, that you remember." Marianne Cooper. The letter had been opened, folded carefully, and preserved with the others. But Holmes's face told me he had seen something more in it. "She was not forgotten," he said. "And this woman, Marianne Cooper, is our last unspoken witness. Her silence was not ignorance, but restraint. She knew where Grace lay. Do you intend to speak with her?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "Her testimony now would serve no justice that has not already found its reckoning. But I shall write to her. Let her know the child's resting place will bear a name at last." He moved to the writing desk and began drafting the letter in his precise hand. The pen scratched softly over the page. The fire cracked behind him. I found myself drawn to the window, to the cathedral rising through the haze. Fog still lingered at the base of the towers, yet above, the lantern of Ely Cathedral had emerged into clear sunlight, a beacon catching the sky. That evening, Inspector Lestrade arrived by rail, bringing with him his usual mix of competence and incredulity. "You've solved it already, have you?" he said as we met him on the platform. "Didn't wait for the yard, of course." "You were needed," Holmes said smoothly, "to ensure that justice proceeds, not merely truth." Lestrade grunted but offered no protest. Once briefed, he read Trevelyan's letter in silence, then folded it crisply. "Motive, means and confession. Well, that's rare enough. Do we know what'll be done about the child's grave?" "I've instructed Dean Ellsworth," Holmes said. "A marker will be placed. The church must carry that burden publicly." Lestrade nodded. "And the man himself?" "He will not resist arrest," Holmes said. "But I suggest you allow him a night's sleep before the journey. It is a long road from Ely to London, and a longer one from silence to redemption." The inspector, perhaps out of respect or weariness, agreed. That night Holmes and I shared a final supper at the inn. The room was warm, the candles low, the mood one of gentle closure. He declined a second glass of claret and instead lit his pipe, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. "You've solved darker cases," I said, "but few that touched you so closely." Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, not with drama, but with quiet conviction. "There are crimes of violence, Watson, and crimes of silence. The former are committed with hands, the latter with omission. In this case, a man died not because of hatred, but because the weight of silence crushed the only soul who had the courage to speak." He tapped the bowl of his pipe against the hearth. "And the irony, it took death to unearth what should have been confessed in life." Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees that lined the street. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell quiet. "You'll write it up?" he asked, glancing toward me. I nodded. "In full. Though I doubt the Strand would publish it as you'd have it." "Let them edit," Holmes said with a flick of his hand. "Let them soften what they must, but be sure of this. Include the name. Grace. Let it not be buried again." The next morning, we departed Ely by the early train. As we rolled past the fens, the land spread out in vast, flat silences, golden with new sunlight. Holmes sat back with his eyes closed, his face free of tension, as though the weight he had carried, like the bishop's, had also found its rest. As for me, I stared out the window, notebook in hand, already shaping the first words. The case was closed. Justice had spoken. But it was the memory of a name, whispered, finally carved in stone, that echoed loudest in my mind. The journey back to Baker Street was a quiet one, the usual rhythm of carriage wheels and train whistles muffled by the somber conclusion to our case in Ely. Holmes, so often restless and prone to talk when the game was afoot, sat in uncharacteristic silence, his long fingers steepled as he gazed out the rain-streaked window. Only the faintest twitch of his lips or narrowing of his eyes betrayed the continued workings of his mind. I respected the silence, sensing his need for reflection, and my own. London received us with its familiar bustle, the clamour of hansoms, the thick, coal-scented air, and the yellow glow of gas lamps piercing the evening gloom. Our return to Baker Street felt almost ritual, Mrs. Hudson greeting us with a kind of relieved fondness as she set out a late supper. For a time, the world seemed to right itself, ordinary and safe. And yet the shadow of Ely lingered, as though the chill of the crypt had clung to Holmes's overcoat. After our meal, Holmes retired to his chair, folding himself into its depths with the air of a man seeking refuge rather than rest. He drew a letter from his pocket, the one he had composed for Marianne Cooper. After reading it through one last time, he sealed it with his signet and set it aside for the morning post. "I sometimes wonder, Watson," he said at length, "how many stones in this city conceal their own forgotten sorrows. One wonders what might be unearthed if all were as diligent as Miss Cooper." I took my customary place opposite him, notebook in hand, though for once my urge to chronicle was blunted by weariness. "You once said, Holmes, that London is a great organism, that it digests its secrets and excretes only what it cannot use. Ely was not so different, I think. The cathedral was built to shelter, but it also served to conceal." Holmes's gaze met mine. "And yet," he replied, "it was the persistence of a few, a bereaved sister, an aging curate, a guilt-stricken bishop, that brought the truth to daylight. That, perhaps, is the hope of any institution, however flawed, that its better souls will not rest until justice is done." He drew his violin from its case and began to tune it, the low notes echoing through the study. The act seemed to settle him. His movements grew measured, almost gentle. "You see now why I decline so many invitations to investigate cases of mere theft or jealousy, Watson. This," He gestured with his bow, encompassing both the memory of Ely and the very air of Baker Street. Is what makes our work both burden and privilege. I nodded, recalling the final moments in Ely, as Inspector Lestrade had taken Lionel Trevelyan into custody. There was no outrage, no violence. Trevelyan had gone with a strange dignity, his confession spoken with a clarity that suggested he had, at last, found the courage his uncle lacked. And in that courage, perhaps, there was the first glimmer of absolution. Days passed. Holmes's spirits gradually brightened, his appetite for intellectual stimulation returning as the fog of Ely receded. The following Sunday, an envelope bearing a Cambridgeshire postmark arrived at Baker Street. I brought it in with the morning tea and set it beside Holmes, who eyed it with mild interest before breaking the seal. He read silently, his features settling into a look of contentment. Then he passed the letter to me. Mr. Holmes, I received your note with more gratitude than I can express. To know my niece will be named, her grave no longer hidden, is a comfort beyond measure. My prayers are with you and with all those who help to lift the stone of silence. May you continue to bring light to darkened places. Yours sincerely, Marianne Cooper. Holmes smiled faintly. There, Watson, a case concluded as it ought to be, not with applause or headlines, but with a heart set at rest. We resumed our routine, yet I found myself haunted by the thought of Ely's silent vault, the little grave newly marked, and the soft persistence of those who remembered. Holmes, ever perceptive, noticed my abstraction. You have the air of a man not yet done with his narrative, he remarked, setting aside the violin and reaching for his pipe. I suppose I have, I admitted. The facts are plain, the evidence secure, and yet I find myself preoccupied with what remains unseen, the quiet cost to all involved. Holmes's eyes grew gentle. That is your virtue as a chronicler, Watson. Not merely to record the events, but to weigh their effect on the souls who endure them. He tapped the pipe on his palm. You see, this is why I value your presence, especially on cases such as these. The law may content itself with the apprehension of the guilty, but justice, real justice, must reach deeper. It must remember the innocent and give voice to the silent. I was silent for a time, pondering his words as the fire in the grate cast shifting shadows about the room. At length I looked up and met Holmes's steady gaze. What would you have done, Holmes? I asked quietly. Had we discovered the secret in time to prevent the bishop's death? Holmes's brow furrowed, then smoothed as he considered. There are times, my dear Watson, when even the greatest detective is powerless against the slow decay of guilt and the inexorable passage of years. We may reveal the truth, but we cannot mend all wounds. My hope is only that, by shedding light, we discourage others from sowing such darkness. He rose and drew the curtains against the dusk. But come, the city waits, and who knows what riddles tomorrow will bring. Let us be ready for them, hearts and minds unburdened, so that when next we are summoned, we may again bear witness for those whom history would forget. I closed my notebook, satisfied at last, and as Holmes set aside his violin and turned once more to his monographs, I knew that, in our peculiar partnership, justice had been served, not only for the dead, but for the living who would remember. Holmes's words lingered with me over the days that followed, echoing in the quiet corners of Baker Street as the case's final notes faded. Our lives, so often propelled by one summons or another, fell into the familiar rhythms, Holmes with his chemistry experiments or violin, myself dividing my time between my practice and my increasingly detailed notes on our recent adventure. Yet the shadow of Ely, its hidden vault, and the name finally spoken, had altered something in both of us. I could see it in Holmes's habitual pauses at the window, in the measured way he folded his newspapers, and in the respectful silence that sometimes fell between us, as though we were reluctant to speak lest we disturb some hard-won peace. Still, the world intrudes, and so too did our daily routines. A week after our return, Holmes received an invitation to a small supper at the Diogenes Club, ostensibly in celebration of some minor diplomatic achievement by Mycroft. It was there, amid the low firelight and even lower murmur of club conversation, that the matter of Ely surfaced once more in an unexpected guise. Mycroft, always attuned to the undercurrents of power and reputation, waited until the port had been passed before broaching the subject. "Word has reached Whitehall, Sherlock, of your recent success at Ely Cathedral." Holmes sipped his port, his eyes steady. It was hardly a triumph, more a matter of old wounds and overdue confession. "Perhaps," Mycroft replied, "but wounds left untended have a way of festering beyond their origin. The public record will never show it, but your intervention spared the church and the town a far more damaging scandal. I'm to convey the gratitude of several who will never say so openly." Holmes merely inclined his head. "The dead cannot be harmed by scandal. The living, perhaps, but the truth ought not to be buried for their sake." Mycroft allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "As you wish. But do not doubt that your actions reached further than the fens of Cambridgeshire." The conversation turned to other matters, yet on our walk home through the fog-laden streets, I could sense Holmes mulling over his brother's words. He broke the silence, his tone contemplative. "There's an irony, Watson, in how the search for truth can so easily become the management of consequences. We sought justice for a child lost to secrecy, but in the end, our actions became part of a much larger pattern. Invisible hands shaping the fates of institutions as well as individuals." I could offer only a sympathetic nod. "Would you have wished it otherwise? That the matter remain hidden?" "No," he said firmly, "but I would wish that the world be better equipped to bear the truth rather than recoil from it. We did what was right. I will not regret it." That night, as I recorded the exchange in my notes, I found myself reflecting not on the outcome of the case, but on the quiet endurance of those who had carried its secret for so long. Marianne Cooper, the anonymous parishioner, even Lionel Trevelyan, all had shouldered a burden shaped as much by society's silence as by individual guilt. A letter arrived the next morning, the handwriting on the envelope instantly familiar. Lestrade's bold, determined script. "Baker Street, dear Holmes. Trevelyan's case has concluded at the assizes. He pleaded guilty, with full confession read before the court. The magistrate took into account his remorse, the bishop's complicity, and your report. He has been remanded to custody, but with recommendation for clemency. There will be no public scandal. The church has consecrated the vault as you advised. The stone bears the name Grace. I thought you would wish to know." Yours, G. Lestrade Holmes, read the letter over my shoulder. "So, justice tempered by mercy. Watson, that is, perhaps, the best we may hope for." Later that week, I made a solitary journey to Ely, driven by a need to see for myself the final result of our labors. The cathedral was much as we had left it, proud, imposing, yet softened in my memory by the knowledge of what lay beneath its stones. In the cool hush of the crypt, I found the new marker, a simple slab, carved with one word, Grace. No surname, no dates, just the acknowledgement of a life, however brief, and the memory preserved. I stood there for some time, lost in thought. A caretaker passed by, pausing to offer a respectful nod. There was nothing to say. The stone spoke for itself. On my return to London, I found Holmes deep in conversation with a young woman whose eyes shone with anxious intelligence. She was seeking help for her father, accused of a theft at his bank, a matter wholly different in nature, and yet I saw at once how Holmes's attention quickened, the old spark rekindled. As the client departed, Holmes turned to me with a faint, almost rueful smile. "The world does not pause for one tragedy, Watson. There are always new puzzles, fresh sorrows, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, small opportunities for redemption. "And so we begin again," I said, hanging my hat by the door. He nodded. "Precisely. That, my friend, is the price and the privilege of our profession." And as the rain pattered softly on the window panes and the city settled into night, I set down my pen at last, the tale of Ely complete. Yet in my heart the whisper of that name remained, a reminder that even the smallest light, once kindled, endures against the darkness. The days that followed seemed to take on a gentler rhythm, as if even the city itself recognized the need for a breath after the storm of secrets unearthed in Ely. Yet the echoes of the case persisted. Not in the press or in the anxious inquiries of Scotland Yard, for Lestrade had managed to contain the facts to the court's closed sessions, but in the subtle shifts of Holmes's manner and my own silent reflections. There was an unspoken agreement between us not to dwell upon the matter, at least not aloud. Holmes returned to his violin and his endless chemical experiments, at times filling the rooms of Baker Street with exotic aromas that Mrs. Hudson bore with remarkable patience. I occupied myself with my patients, the routine complaints of city life oddly reassuring after the rarefied anguish of cathedral and crypt. But late at night I would find Holmes seated by the window, the lamp turned low, smoke curling from his pipe as he stared into the darkness beyond the glass. He never mentioned Ely, but I suspected that his thoughts lingered still on the chain of choices and silences that had shaped the tragedy there. The measure of a detective, I sometimes thought, was not only in the crimes he unraveled, but in the burdens he bore for having looked so deeply into the darkness of others' lives. It was on such an evening, perhaps a week after the court's verdict, that an unexpected knock came at our door. I opened it to find Dean Ellsworth himself, the lines of his face softened by exhaustion, but also, I thought, by relief. He removed his hat and stepped inside, casting a grateful glance toward Holmes. "I am returning to Ely tonight, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, "but I could not do so without calling upon you in person." Holmes motioned for him to take the armchair by the fire. "I trust the cathedral is more at peace, Dean?" Ellsworth nodded, folding his hands. "The atmosphere has changed, immeasurably so. The townspeople sense it, even if they do not know the reasons. There are fewer whispers. The bells ring clear. The congregation has swelled, though many come simply to read the new stone in the crypt. Some bring flowers, some stand in silence, but all leave knowing something hidden has been set right." He hesitated, then drew a sealed envelope from his coat and handed it to Holmes. "A letter arrived at the cathedral yesterday, addressed simply to the one who sought the truth. It seemed only proper you should have it." Holmes accepted the letter, studying the plain writing on its front, then broke the seal and read aloud. "You have my gratitude, though you will never know my name. I'm one of many who bore the weight of silence, not through malice, but out of fear. For others, for the church, for myself. Now that the grave is marked, a piece of that weight has lifted. Thank you for your courage in facing what others would not. May you find peace as you have given it to others." For a moment, the fire's crackle filled the silence that followed. Ellsworth rose. "I believe that is the last word the case will ever yield, Mr. Holmes. The rest must be left to God." Holmes inclined his head, his expression distant but softened. "Sometimes, Dean, the truth is not a matter for judgment, but for witness. Thank you for bringing the letter." The Dean shook my hand warmly, then Holmes's, before taking his leave into the night. I watched from the window as his figure disappeared into the fog, a solitary shape receding toward the station and the silent stones of Ely. Holmes remained still for some time, the letter resting upon his knee. At last he looked up. "The true end of a case, Watson, is not the verdict, nor even the confession. It is in the small mercies that follow, the faint but certain sense that the world has grown a shade lighter for the effort." I nodded. setting aside my notes and pouring us each a brandy. The hour had grown late, but neither of us felt inclined to sleep. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you ever regret it? The cost of dragging such secrets into the open?" He considered this, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "To regret is human, Watson. But I would regret more to stand aside and let darkness go unchallenged. We are not arbiters of fate, you and I, but simply men who refuse to look away." His words seemed to close a door on the matter more finally than any verdict or memorial stone could. The fire dwindled, our conversation wandered, and at last I found myself drifting to sleep in my chair, lulled by the reassurance of Baker Street's gentle routines. Holmes's silhouette, outlined against the lamplight, seemed at peace for the first time since our return. So the case of the confession buried with the bishop ended not with triumph, but with something quieter and, in its way, more enduring. The knowledge that a forgotten name had been remembered, that justice and mercy had found a rare accord, and that, in the silent spaces between bells, a small corner of the world had been made whole. And so, as the first hints of dawn crept into the city, I closed my eyes at last, content to let the shadows recede, secure in the knowledge that, when next the call for truth arose, Sherlock Holmes would answer it, as ever, with unwavering resolve. The following days were marked by a peculiar stillness. The city continued its ceaseless rhythm, but within the walls of 221B Baker Street, Holmes and I found ourselves moving with a kind of deliberate quietude that only comes after the resolution of a great case, or perhaps the exorcism of a lingering sorrow. Holmes, for his part, buried himself in the folds of the Times, his gaze flitting occasionally to the window as if he expected a new summons at any moment. I busied myself with my practice, yet more than once, as I sat across from a worried mother or a coughing child, my mind wandered back to Ely, the scent of damp stone, the tremor in Lionel Trevelyan's voice, the soft echo of footsteps lost among the pews. One afternoon, as a persistent drizzle streaked the glass and London's bells pealed faintly through the fog, I found Holmes perched on the window seat, his knees drawn up, fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the pane. He did not look up when I entered, but gestured for me to sit. "You have that look again, Watson," he remarked without preamble, "as if some ghost lingers in your peripheral vision." "Perhaps it does," I replied, unable to keep a faint smile from my lips. "Or perhaps it is the echo of Grace's story, and the uneasy notion that we are never far from such secrets, even here." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, setting aside his abstraction, he turned to me with that keen, focused light that signaled his mind was already moving toward new purpose. "I have been considering the nature of closure, Watson, not merely in our work, but in life itself. You recall how the Dean described the congregation at Ely, drawn not by morbid curiosity, but by a desire to witness the stone, to bring flowers, to stand in silent contemplation. There is something profoundly human in the act of remembrance. Perhaps it is our truest answer to the shadows of the past." I nodded. To remember is to honor, even when there are no words to explain the sorrow. "Exactly," Holmes said. "And in remembering, we do not allow the past to rule us. We simply accept that it is part of the tapestry." There was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with the day's post. Among the bills and advertisements, a single thick envelope with a foreign stamp. Holmes glanced at it, curiosity sharpening his features, and broke the seal. He withdrew a letter and a photograph. The letter was written in an elegant, continental hand. "Monsieur Holmes, permit me to convey my admiration for your recent inquiry at Ely Cathedral. News of your work, though couched in discreet terms, has found its way even to Paris. The matter you resolved has rekindled in me a certain hope. That truth, when pursued with both rigor and compassion, may yet bring light to the most ancient of sorrows." Should you ever find yourself in France, I would be honored to meet and perhaps share with you a case of my own, equally shrouded in history's shadows. Until then, I remain your devoted reader, Hercule Poirot. Holmes's eyes danced with a rare amusement as he passed me the letter. It seems, Watson, that even our continental counterparts are drawn to the scent of secrets laid bare. I studied the photograph, Poirot himself, unmistakable with his perfectly waxed mustache, seated by a grand window with the Seine visible behind him. There was a twinkle in his eye that matched Holmes's own. "Are you tempted?" I asked, smiling. Holmes considered. "I should like to cross swords, or rather wits, with Monsieur Poirot, but not just yet. For the moment, I am content to let the world's mysteries pass in review from the comfort of Baker Street." He placed the letter on the mantel beside the others, a small smile lingering on his lips. As the rain eased, I felt the weight that had hung over us begin at last to lift. Holmes's violin soon filled the rooms with gentle melodies, and I returned to my desk, finishing the last pages of my account, ensuring that the story of Grace, the bishop, and all who bore witness to the past would be remembered as more than a footnote in a ledger. Yet as dusk fell and the first lamps flickered on in the street below, I was struck by the realization that every ending, even one so full of resolution and humility, was also a beginning. For the truth is never simply buried or exhumed. It lives on, changed and changing, in the hearts of those who seek it, and so, as Holmes played into the night and the fire cast its warmth across our sitting room, I felt, as I often had at the end of our strangest, most poignant adventures, a quiet gratitude for the gift of companionship and for the simple, profound act of remembrance. In the hush that followed, I closed my notebook, my heart lighter. Outside, London's fog crept softly through the streets, but within our home, the light endured. And somewhere in Ely, under stone, a name had been restored, and at last a measure of peace. The months that followed unfolded with the deceptive quietude that sometimes settles after a storm, as if the city itself were catching its breath. The episode in Ely, though unremarked upon by the popular press and known only in whispers within certain circles, cast a long shadow over our work at Baker Street. It was not the horror of the crime itself that lingered. London was never short of violence, nor of secrets, but rather the revelation of how frail and how persistent the human heart could be in its need for absolution. I saw it in Holmes most clearly. For all his legendary detachment, he seemed more willing to linger in the sitting room's golden evening lamplight, listening as I read aloud, or exchanging quiet speculations on the news of the day. At times, he even indulged my reminiscences of old campaigns or accepted a second cup of tea, with a wry smile, as if yielding for a moment to the gentler tides of memory. Yet even in such tranquility, Holmes's mind was never idle. I watched him assemble delicate models of cathedral arches and crypts from toothpicks and sealing wax, sometimes lost for hours in the mathematical beauty of their forms. More than once, I found the locket from Ely upon his desk, the little painting of the girl, Grace, turned toward the sunlight, as if she too had found her way at last, out of shadow. It was a rainy evening in early spring, as the city shook off winter's grip, when a visitor came to Baker Street, a priest by his collar with haunted eyes, and a voice trembling between apology and hope. Holmes welcomed him in with the gentle courtesy he reserved for the truly burdened. "Mr. Holmes, I am Father Martin Crowe, of St. Agnes, Paddington. I do not seek to intrude, but I have heard, discreetly through Dean Ellsworth, that you possess a gift for uncovering the truth and for kindness to the broken." Holmes inclined his head. "How may I assist you, Father?" The priest's fingers twisted in his hat. "A member of my flock, a young woman, has vanished. Her family fears disgrace, There are whispers of debts, perhaps blackmail. But it is the manner of her disappearance, so sudden, so silent, that troubles me most. I was told at Ely that you see beyond what others overlook. Holmes listened intently, but I saw in the set of his mouth that Ely's wounds had made him still more attuned to suffering and to the danger of leaving pain unspoken. "Describe her disappearance, Father," Holmes said. "Begin with the last day you saw her. Spare no detail, however trivial it may seem." As the priest spoke, Holmes questioned him gently, pressing here and there until the shape of the problem began to emerge. A family beset by old secrets, a sudden withdrawal of funds from a parish charity, an anonymous note threatening exposure. It was, in its bones, a story both familiar and ever new. A tale of shame and concealment, of silent burdens and desperate hopes. When Father Crow departed, gratitude and anxiety warring on his features, Holmes stood by the window, looking out at the flickering lamps and the silhouettes drifting beneath them. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "it is never truly finished. Every grave we mark, every secret we unearth, creates a space for new hope and new sorrow. The world does not mend itself by our small efforts, but perhaps it is made less cruel by them." He turned then, his familiar spark rekindled. "Come, my friend. There is work to be done in Paddington, and I suspect that the ghosts of Ely have not finished their lessons with us." We set out into the evening, the air bracing and alive with the city's ceaseless tide. As we moved through the streets, I found my mind returning once more to Grace's name etched in stone, and to Marianne Cooper's letter, her prayer that her niece would not be forgotten. Each case, I realized, was not only a puzzle to be solved, but a life, or a dozen lives, woven together by grief, hope, and memory. Later that night, as Holmes and I pieced together the first clues of our new investigation, he paused over a scrap of evidence, an envelope addressed in a trembling hand, its wax seal unbroken. "I wonder, Watson, whether there will ever come a day when truth is welcomed rather than feared, when confession is not the end of hope, but its beginning." I did not answer at once. Instead, I watched as he carefully broke the seal, revealing the secrets within, just as we had done so many times before. And so we continued, stepping out again into the darkness, not to banish it, but to carry a little light further, name by name, story by story, trusting that what we did mattered, not only to the living, but to the dead who depended on us to be remembered. In the hush that followed, I found myself silently grateful. For Holmes, for truth, for the small but abiding mercy of remembrance. And as another story began to unfold, I realized, with sudden clarity, that the greatest detective of his age was also, perhaps, its quietest guardian of hope. We left Baker Street in a hush, broken only by the gentle clatter of the cab's wheels and the low rumble of distant thunder. Spring's renewal muddied by grey skies. Holmes, deep in thought beside me, gazed out at the shifting tapestry of London. Children in narrow lanes, clerks hurrying beneath umbrellas, a lamplighter tipping his pole to a clouded globe. There was a peculiar steadiness about Holmes after the Ely case, as though the ordeal had tempered his usual restlessness with an extra measure of humility. I felt it too, a keen awareness of the vulnerability behind every locked door. As the cab rolled into Paddington, Father Crow's description echoing in my mind, I reflected on the similarities between our current quest and the confessions of Ely. Where one had led us into stone vaults and secrets years concealed, this new search began with a family's desperate silence, an anxious priest and a vanished girl. And yet, beneath the surface, the same elements churned: shame, secrecy, and the faint hope that, by seeking, one might mend what had been broken. We arrived at the Crow residence, a modest terrace house hemmed by budding lilacs and smoke from distant chimneys. The priest himself greeted us, his gratitude mingled with worry. Inside, the girl's mother, pale, with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, welcomed us to a small book-lined parlor, cluttered with signs of an interrupted life. A knitting basket overturned, a teacup grown cold, a half-written letter on the bureau. Holmes questioned the family with the patient tact I had seen only in his rarest moods, coaxing forth facts without ever letting the pain of their telling deepen the wound. The girl's name was Alice Crowe, bright, affectionate, given to acts of kindness in the parish. Her disappearance, the mother insisted, was as abrupt as it was inexplicable. Holmes's eyes missed nothing. He gently requested Alice's last letter, the note that had so disturbed the household. I read over his shoulder as he unfolded the page. "Mother, I am sorry for my silence. I will return soon. Please do not fear for me. I have done nothing wrong, but I cannot explain myself just yet. If you hear anything about the parish funds, do not believe what is whispered. All will be clear in time. Love, Alice." Holmes examined the handwriting, held the note to the light, then replaced it. "May I see her room?" he asked quietly. We followed the mother up a narrow flight of stairs. The girl's room was tidy, books in neat piles, a simple dress draped over a chair. Holmes moved from desk to window, fingering the edge of the carpet, the sill, the scattered scraps in the wastebasket. He picked out a tiny photograph. A younger Alice, smiling beside a girl in servant's dress. "Who is this?" Holmes inquired. The mother hesitated. "Her friend, Mary Templeton. She left service last winter. The girls stayed in touch. I believe Mary moved to Lambeth." Holmes tucked the photograph into his pocket. "I will need her direction. And may I see the parish's ledgers?" Downstairs, Father Crowe produced the battered account books, recently inspected by a committee after the whispers began. Holmes bent over them, lips pursed, scanning the columns with lightning speed. "The withdrawals are small, regular, almost hidden among the alms," he murmured. "And yet the pattern is odd. Money sent to an orphanage. But the address is no longer valid. Payments continue even after the institution is closed." Father Crowe looked stricken. "I trusted Alice with those entries. She said she was helping a friend." Holmes closed the ledger. "I do not think she lied, Father. But she is protecting someone. Perhaps Mary, perhaps another." We left the Crowe home as dusk thickened and the first drops of rain splattered on the pavement. Holmes's stride quickened, a new urgency animating his steps. "To Lambeth, Watson. There we may find Mary Templeton, and the true reason for Alice's disappearance." The journey was short, the questions at a workhouse door answered by a weary supervisor who recalled Mary's name. She was ill, the woman said, but might receive visitors. In a narrow candle-lit room, Mary Templeton lay on a cot, her face drawn, yet her eyes brightened at our names. Holmes wasted no time in explanation, but gently pressed her for news of Alice. "She came to me last week," Mary whispered, her voice rough with fever. "She had been threatened. Someone in the parish said they knew what she was doing with the money. But she wasn't stealing for herself, Mr. Holmes. She was paying for my medicine, for the care I couldn't get after I lost my post. She never wanted anyone to know, least of all her parents. She said she would clear her name, but that she needed time and she begged me not to tell. I'm sorry if I have made things worse." Holmes reassured her gently, then asked, "Did she say where she was going?" Mary nodded, struggling to sit up. "To the old orphanage. She wanted to meet the man who sent the threats. She said she would make him confess." Holmes's eyes flashed with concern. "And she went alone?" Mary nodded. "She said it was her burden." We thanked Mary and hurried out, the rain now steady, the night deepening. Holmes flagged a cab, the urgency in his manner unmistakable. "We must reach that orphanage, Watson. If Alice has confronted her blackmailer alone, she may be in grave danger. There is something in her letter. A quiet courage, yes, but also a desperation. The past, once buried, has a way of drawing the innocent to its brink. The cab clattered through the darkened streets, the city's pulse quickening around us. As we approached the shuttered gates of the old orphanage, Holmes turned to me, his eyes fierce and clear. "Stay close, Watson. For all that has passed, I've learned one truth. Those who guard secrets most jealously are often the ones with most to lose. Let us hope we are not too late." We descended from the cab and stepped into the uncertain dark, hearts pounding, the memory of Eli, its vaults, its secrets, its small acts of remembrance, guiding us onward toward whatever waited in the shadowed halls beyond. Holmes led the way through the crumbling iron gates, the old orphanage looming before us in spectral silence. The night air was thick with rain and memory. Puddles reflected the broken sign, St. Hilda's Home for Children, tilted like a gravestone over some forgotten sorrow. Holmes paused, lantern in hand, his gaze flickering across every detail, muddy footprints by the threshold, the faint glint of a torn page fluttering in the breeze. He touched my arm, signaling silence, and we entered. Inside, the stale chill was cut by the distant sound of voices. Holmes gestured for caution, and we moved softly, weaving past peeling plaster and the remains of abandoned toys. In a parlor at the back, the lantern's glow caught a tableau. Alice Crowe, standing tense but determined, and a man, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, face familiar from the parish committee. It was Mr. Willoughby, the parish treasurer. "You cannot keep threatening me," Alice was saying, her voice low but steady. "I have nothing left to give. You know why I did what I did. If you tell them, you will ruin more than just me." Willoughby's reply was harsh, edged with desperation. "You little fool, I covered for you. No one would have noticed a few pounds missing, but then you started giving away more. You and your friend, always with your good works. If you speak, they'll see you as a thief and me as a liar. We'll both go down." Holmes stepped forward, his voice slicing the air. "I rather think you'll be the only one to fall, Mr. Willoughby." Both turned sharply. Alice's face registered shock, then relief. Willoughby, cornered, made a move as if to flee, but Holmes's height and calm command checked him. "I have heard enough," Holmes continued. "Your threats end tonight. I've reviewed the ledgers. The pattern is clear. The so-called missing funds are precisely those redirected to medical care for Miss Templeton, and your own falsified accounts hid far greater sums embezzled over years. Alice acted from compassion, not greed. You acted from cowardice." The man's bravado collapsed. He sagged into a chair, head in hands. Holmes pressed on. "You used Alice's secret, a secret born of kindness, to extort her silence, all the while covering your own theft. When she refused, you sent threats. Fortunately, Miss Crowe did not let fear rule her. She came to confront you, but she came prepared to confess if needed. That courage will be her vindication, not her downfall." Police, summoned discreetly by Holmes earlier that evening, arrived within minutes. Willoughby, resigned, offered no resistance. Holmes explained the essentials, careful to keep Alice's role as merciful as the facts allowed. By the time the rain slackened and dawn threatened the horizon, the case was settled. Alice cleared, Willoughby arrested, and the Crowe family gathered in tearful gratitude. As we stepped into the pale morning light, Holmes stood a moment beneath the dripping eaves, drawing a deep, satisfied breath. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "even among the city's newest wounds, the same patterns emerge. Secrets, shame, the weight of silence. But there is also the possibility of grace. Sometimes the innocent simply need someone to bear witness for them and to call darkness by its name." He handed Alice's letter back to me. "Preserve this, Watson. It belongs with the others. Every act of courage is a thread that binds these stories together. we returned to Baker Street in thoughtful silence, the case's final truths settling in our minds. Later, as Holmes set aside his violin and I finished my account, we reflected on the path that had brought us from Ely's shadowed crypt to the flickering lamplight of London's streets. Holmes, pipe in hand, gazed into the hearth. The world is not changed by a single grave, or even by a dozen, but every secret revealed, every name remembered, pushes back the dark. If only for a moment, that is enough. I nodded, recalling the stone in Ely, the prayers in Paddington, the whispered thanks of the living and the silent debt owed the dead. I wrote the final words of my account as Holmes leaned back, eyes closed, content. And so, with the city once again settling into its daily tide and the morning sun glancing off the windows of Baker Street, the case closed, not in triumph, but in quiet restoration. For in our small labours, another shadow had been dispelled, another lost name reclaimed, and hope, as always, had found its voice in the act of remembrance.